Disaster in China, 1,000 people dead in huge Yangtze River flood. The big tick, Cambodian elections considered a success. Rebuilding shattered lives in Papua New Guinea. A 9-day wonder, Austrian miner rescued from underground tomb. Good evening, I'm Indira Naidu. First tonight to the flooding in China, which has now claimed at least 1,000 lives. There's no end in sight to the rainfall, which has submerged towns and cities near the mighty Yangtze River. Millions of people are working round the clock to try to reinforce the river's crumbling banks. Australia Tonight pledged emergency assistance of $150,000 to help the flood's many victims.
This is the result of the worst flooding on the Yangtze River since 1954. In Hunan province, the town of Chenglingji once stood on the banks of a lake. Now it's part of that lake, consumed by the rapidly rising floodwaters. Everyone has fled, with flooding reaching the roofs of most homes. The only way to get around is by boat, and the flooding is so severe, even tugboats can negotiate their way around what were once busy streets. The rain is expected to worsen overnight and continue until the middle of the week. Recently, 10 centimetres a day has been falling. It's a deluge which the authorities are powerless to do anything about. Millions of officials, soldiers and civilians have been drafted in to try to stem the floodwaters for the time being at least. But digging and sandbagging are no match for the power of Mother Nature. Realising they are fighting a losing battle, officials are considering a new tactic, flooding selected areas to keep floodwaters from overwhelming dikes and wiping out major towns and cities. But this is already a nightmare for China. The Yangtze Basin is home to a third of the country's 1.2 billion population and accounts for 40% of the country's industrial and agricultural output. The river has a long history of disasters, unleashing widespread flooding every few decades. Unless the rain subsides soon, this one has the potential to be the worst in living memory.
Emergency workers have been forced to seal off more land in the tidal wave devastated area of northern Papua New Guinea. The area is contaminated with decomposing bodies. And while authorities grapple with the destruction, survivors are coming together to try to rebuild their lives.
For the people of northern Papua New Guinea, even a church service is a grim reminder of their awful predicament. Before the giant waves came, a congregation like this would be filled with children singing. Now, most of them are dead, and those who survived the tsunami are trying to come to terms with exactly what happened.
Sometimes the earth moves and stretches. And a week ago or so, it stretched under the earth, under the sea, and lifted the sea, and the sea had nowhere to go but where it went. Nobody did anything wrong. It is just the way the earth is.
The Australian Army has been providing not only spiritual, also medical relief. This small service was held in a military field hospital in Vanimo. Most patients were too ill to attend.
Okay, here we are.
This is one of dozens of emergency medical units set up by the Australian Defence Forces in PNG's Western Sepik province. They're caring for some of the 5,000 islanders who have been left homeless. In latest developments, one of the worst hit areas, Sasano Lagoon, has been sealed off. There are still too many bodies for burying parties to deal with. At last count, 1,600 are confirmed dead. 2,000 people are still missing.
Earlier I spoke to Father Glenn Murphy, the priest who officiated at one of yesterday's memorial masses, and asked him what the mood was like at the service.
The people here are very faithful people, a very strong faith, and I think that really it was a good mood for everyone. The service personnel and the local people needed it, I think, and I think we all felt the benefit of it.
Now, so many children and young people were killed. Are some people there viewing it as some sort of punishment from God?
Certainly not, and indeed I spoke to that point specifically at that service yesterday. These people live very close to nature. They are fishermen. They get their food from the land and their timber and shelter. They understand that these things can happen. They and everyone hope and pray that they never do happen. Unfortunately, it did. And while they are grieving and mourning and very, very shocked, and the tragedy is one of immense proportions, there is a very quiet faith there and a very strong sense of bonding that they have with their communities.
Are there any signs yet of an optimism that they can rebuild their lives?
Oh yes, further down the line towards Atape, at places such as Ramu and Po, where villages have become care centres and have doubled in size, the infrastructure is already in place. Food, clothes, shelter, agricultural tools, all these things are becoming available.
So what else can the international community do?
I think the international community simply needs not to forget, I suppose.
Father Murphy, thanks very much for your time tonight. There are hopes tonight for a new era of stability in Cambodia following national elections in which at least 90% of the population turned out to vote. The only reported violence, a Khmer Rouge attack on the village of Ong Long Ven near the Thai border, which left 10 people dead. The election results won't be known for another week, but they're certain to end in a coalition government comprising leader Hun Sen, royalist Prince Norodom Ranariddh and leading dissident Sam Rainsy.
Despite the attack in An Long Vang, it's been a surprisingly peaceful election. Cambodians exercising their democratic rights with great enthusiasm. As the votes are counted, it's been revealed that the turnout was over 90%, as high as 96% in some areas.
My prediction is close, and no party would win the outright majority to form a government of its own.
And that throws up the prospect of Prince Ranariddh and Hun Sen being forced to work together once again. The two men are sworn enemies. Cambodians are nervous.
The next few days are very important. The counting process, which is on today, is obviously an extremely crucial part of all of that. And it's too early, I think, to make any assessment of that. But it's going ahead from what we hear quite normally.
Preliminary results are expected to be released late tonight, but it may be the weekend before the true picture is known. Collating the votes and counting them is a mammoth task in a country where the infrastructure is rudimentary at best. The main fear here today revolves around Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party. It's run this country for nearly 2 decades. If it fares badly, it could split. A disastrous scenario considering it controls both the police and the army.
People are still nervous, and there are also a concern over the possibility of the use of force of arms if the CPP were to lose badly.
But observers hope common sense will prevail. Once again, the eyes of the world are on Cambodia. It's hoped the major players have learned from their past mistakes.
And Brian joins us on the line now from Phnom Penh. Brian, how's the count going?
Very slowly, Indira, but it is proceeding. Within the next 2 hours, the National Election Committee, which is overseeing this vote, hope to start issuing preliminary results. These results won't be confirmed until they've been checked and double-checked, which could take until Saturday. But over the next 24 hours, the picture should become clear. I can tell you that in Phnom Penh, Prince Ranariddh's Phunsan Pak party and the Sam Rainsy party are said to be in joint first place with Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party, trailing badly behind. But that's only in Phnom Penh. Phunsan Pak did well in the capital last time round, so we really have to wait and see how the votes in the provinces stack up before we know who's ahead in the country as a whole.
Now, there's been some debate among the Australian contingent about just how free and fair this election has been. What's the overall view of the international observers?
Well, in the 12 months running up to the election, over 100 opposition activists were killed, and particularly in the outlying areas, there's been reports of widespread intimidation in the days and weeks leading up to yesterday's vote. So in those circumstances, it would be impossible to describe the election as free and fair. The Joint International Observer Group is meeting as we speak here in Phnom Penh to attempt to come to some sort of conclusion. They are positive about how the polling went yesterday. That's been confirmed to me tonight, but my bet is that they'll stick with the previous statement, which says that in the circumstances of Cambodia, the poll has been broadly representative of the will of the people.
And is that good enough?
I think it will cause some consternation amongst some people here. They don't see why Cambodia should have a lower threshold than anyone else. But you have to take into account the circumstances. Prince Rana has only just recently returned to the country. This country has been in a mess ever since the civil war here. So I think it is good enough for the majority of the observers.
Brian Thompson in Phnom Penh, many thanks. And Cambodia has been an issue at the ASEAN meeting in Manila, where regional leaders are tonight discussing a wide range of concerns, including the welfare of Myanmar opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi. US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has expressed concern about the safety of the Nobel Prize winner, who has reportedly been trapped in a car in provincial Myanmar for the past 4 days while attempting to visit supporters there. Grave concern was also expressed tonight over nuclear tests by India and Pakistan. But the host nation itself has not been free of its own troubles, with violent clashes marring the international gathering.
It should have been a moment of dignity. Heads of state gathered for measured and reasonable talks. But the Philippines offered this important time and these dignified guests a different vision altogether. Subic Bay, site of the former US naval base. Supporters of the sacked chief of this Freeport complex had dug in, refusing to leave the area till their boss was reinstated. People power versus the riot squad, and for a while it looked like the rage and frenzy of the protesters was just too strong. But in Manila, the pleasantries went on. A showcase for Japan's Prime Minister-in-waiting Kizo Abuchi.
And the President looks forward to seeing you soon.
At a meeting with Philippine President Joseph Estrada, he gave assurances that Japanese assistance to this nation would not be disturbed. And he reached out to leaders of the world, anxious for signs that this man can lead Japan and the region back from its teetering uncertainties. But markets in Tokyo weren't confident today that Abuchi has that wherewithal. The Nikkei fell 417.53 points, and the US dollar surged against the yen. Also at ASEAN, talk of Cambodia maybe rejoining the group, with praise for what leaders here believe were generally free and honest elections. If any of that talk was of interest or comfort to the demonstrators of Subic Bay, they were in no position to show it. The police there having been given orders to use maximum restraint to end this vicious and embarrassing encounter. That meant live bullets and injuries as the protesters boiled into the night. An evening that, for one Philippine group, marked struggle against change, while for another in the capital, it meant finding ways to understand a bigger, broader change in Asia and to somehow embrace it for the better.
A man who was given up for dead after being trapped down a mine in Austria for 9 days has been found alive. But hopes are now fading for 10 rescue workers who went missing during the search for the lost miner.
9 days after a landslip had trapped him underground, almost everyone believed the worst. That 24-year-old Georg Heinzel could not have survived. His family had even been notified of his death. But this rescue team from Germany did not give up, and last night at the mine shaft, suddenly he was found.
Kommt! Kommt!
He's coming, they shouted. Then they switched off the lights to protect his eyes after 9 days in darkness underground.
They broke through to the recreation room where Georg was, and they heard him saying, "Hello, this is Georg," and he was okay. He was fine. He was sitting there at a table and waiting there for 9 days without water and food.
So he had nothing to drink at all?
No, it seems not. He was completely dehydrated. The first thing they handed him down was a liter of lemonade, and then they brought him up very quickly.
There was applause as the ambulance arrived to take Georg Heinzel to hospital. Doctors declared him in remarkable health, and the small town of Lassing had its own local hero.
Wir waren alle so beeindruckt. Hat mit einem kräftigen Danke, das war das Erste, was gesagt hat, und dann einen Kumpel offensichtlich erkannt, trotz der Dunkelheit, und gesagt, Servus.
Some politicians even described it as the work of God.
Großes Wunder ist geschehen. Ein Wunder in Lassing. Das kann ich nur sagen dazu, und überglücklich.
Despite the joy at the success of the rescue, celebrations have been muted because 10 other miners are still missing. It's feared they were buried under a second landslip when they went down to rescue Georg Heinzel a week ago. Somewhere deep under this crater, they may still be fighting for their lives, but hopes for them are fading.
To Kosovo, where hundreds more villagers have been driven from their homes in another major offensive by Serb forces. The Serb authorities say their move is intended to reopen the main road between Peš and the capital Pristina, which they claim has been blocked by ethnic Albanian rebels.
Serb police assault the tiny village of Sportsa in what was KLA-dominated central Kosovo. Now Serb armour is driving them out in the first major Yugoslav offensive since the threat of NATO intervention 6 weeks ago calls them to scale back their attacks. But there seem few signs of restraint today, as tank guns and cannon were used to destroy many of the houses in Sportsa. The inevitable price is another flow of refugees, with many hundreds moving out of these mountain villages over the last 2 days. Some fled from another town, Orahovac, only last week, and are now homeless for the second time in quick succession. Many are camping in the forests and say they have no idea where else to go. And as the Serbs continue their advance into the KLA heartland, their numbers seem likely to grow. Until yesterday, this was KLA territory, but now, having driven the fighters out, the Serbs are systematically burning their homes and villages. The Serbs say the offensive is directed at the KLA alone and to regain control of major roads. But the burning of remote villages like Sportsa can have little military value while adding hugely to the suffering of Kosovo.
Lawyers for US President Bill Clinton are tonight negotiating with independent counsel Kenneth Starr on the terms under which Mr Clinton might give evidence before a grand jury investigating the Monica Lewinsky case. The lawyers are fighting to avoid the president from making a personal appearance, an effort designed to limit the scope of questioning.
He's already denied on oath having sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, but Mr Starr now wants to cross-examine him to see if he's lied. Mr Clinton's staff went on the offensive.
Less than 2 weeks from now is the anniversary of Ken Starr's appointment. I don't think any American ever thought 4 years ago that we would be at this situation, while that office has been stayed open, spent $40 million, that we would not be able to come to a conclusion.
The president is technically due to testify in front of the grand jury here early this week, but the subpoena may not be legally enforceable. His lawyers are trying to negotiate a compromise.
I suspect the most Starr will agree to here is to interrogate the president at the White House at a time convenient for the president and by way of videotape deposition.
The lawyers will continue negotiating over the president's testimony tomorrow. But at this stage, it looks very much as though President Clinton will have to answer more questions on oath about Monica Lewinsky.
Cuba has been celebrating the 45th anniversary of the birth of the Communist Revolution. Thousands gathered at the Moncado barracks, the site of the coup attempt which launched the revolution, to listen to a 5-hour speech from President Fidel Castro. He assured his supporters that despite the economic hardship the country had suffered, both he and the revolution were still intact. In Britain, a derelict 22-storey block of flats has been reduced to rubble in a spectacular controlled demolition in front of 7,000 people. The East London block, once home to hundreds of families, was collapsed in just 5 seconds. The demolition was hailed as a total success, with strategically placed explosives transforming the 20,000-tonne building into a neat pile of perfectly shattered concrete. And a bit of lip that would leave many a politician lost for words. No one has come close to challenging Steve Woodward's 8-year reign as the Guinness Book of World Records fastest talker.
Almost as soon as I could talk, I was always one of these kids that would consistently rabbit on about nothing. In fact, I could talk very fast about anything, and throughout the rest of my life I had to consciously and slowly slow myself down, otherwise people would say, slow down, I can't understand a word of what you're saying.
While the average person speaks between 40 and 80 words per minute, Steve is still apparently articulate at 630 words per minute.
My sleep was over in the heart, there's natural sufficient to confirmation about which I see sheets around to new others, rather bad, those we had in the party, I know what else such conscious made to make council form, thus made to resolution.
That's an extract from Hamlet's soliloquy. We'll have to take Steve's word for it. Here, Prime Minister John Howard has denied claims of divisions within federal cabinet over tax reform. Opposition leader Kim Beazley says it's been 454 days since reform plans were announced, but there's still no detail. The Prime Minister says it's more important to get the package right.
The Prime Minister was on the hustings promoting his government's record on youth traineeships and apprenticeships. The opposition leader was also out and about promoting himself. His biography, not surprisingly titled Beazley, launched with much fanfare and support from Labor luminaries past and present. But for both leaders, the policy emphasis was tax reform, with John Howard trying to steer attention beyond the foreshadowed GST.
It will be an overall tax reform plan, and it will be the next logical step in giving further protection to Australia against the backdrop of the Asian economic downturn.
You have to be earning at least a minimum of 60 grand for it to be worth your while, and there are not an awful lot of Australians out there who are doing that.
The results of a study by the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economics and Social Research tend to bear that out, although they haven't factored in any compensation package.
And it's certainly true that the lower your income is, the more you're likely to suffer on the broadest base. Not true.
That broadest base means no exemptions, and according to the study would need to be 13.7%. Welfare organisations want food and health care exempted, which would lift the rate to 18.2%. Surprisingly, the study says either would benefit the economy.
The GST that has health and food out of it produces economic growth, so does a broad-based GST.
Federal Cabinet is expected to sign off on the final tax package when it meets in Sydney tomorrow, with the release date possibly as soon as next week.
To finance, and a slide on the Tokyo stock market pulled the Australian share market 1% lower, the All Ords down 30 points. In Tokyo, the Nikkei fell 2.6%, closing below 16,000 points for the first time in a month amid concerns about the next cabinet. Wall Street was closed for the weekend. The Australian dollar was down against all the major currencies. To motor racing, and Finland's Mika Hakkinen has survived an accident-marred Austrian Grand Prix to take out his 5th Formula One race of the season. Hakkinen's McLaren teammate David Coulthard snapped up 2nd position, with 2-time world champion Michael Schumacher coming 3rd despite this excursion onto the gravel. 3 spectators have been killed and 6 others injured while watching a motor race in the United States. The tragedy happened after Mexican driver Adrian Fernandez hit a concrete wall. The impact sent the wheel bouncing over the safety barrier and into the crowd. And more drama this time across the Tasman, where a spectator broke both legs when he was hit by a speeding car during the Rally of New Zealand. It was the worst in a spate of accidents which sent several cars off the road. Important soccer news tonight. Sydney's new National Soccer League team, Northern Spirit, has been taken over before a ball has even been kicked. The millionaire owner of English First Division club Crystal Palace, Mark Goldberg, has bought a majority stake in the Spirit, making it Australia's first overseas-owned club. Former Socceroo coach Terry Venables is now manager at Palace. A reciprocal agreement will see Crystal Palace and Northern Spirit coaching staff dividing their time between Australia and England. Tomorrow's weather now. Brisbane, rain developing 23. Sydney, rain clearing early, then cold, gusty winds 15. Canberra, rain easing to showers 10. Hobart, rain periods 12. Melbourne, rain at times and windy 13. Adelaide, showers and windy 13. Perth, sunny but cold 15, and for Darwin, fine 33. In our region, Beijing 27, Jakarta 33, Manila 34, Port Moresby 26 and Tokyo 30. And around the world, Athens 38, Buenos Aires 15, Istanbul 29, London 23 and New York 28. Now, just before we go, they say history repeats itself, but they're not always right. At the weekend, the grandson of Louis Bleriot, who was the first to fly across the English Channel, tried to repeat his grandfather's historic effort, but things didn't turn out as he planned.
With such a famous predecessor, it was perhaps inevitable one day Louis Bleriot Jr. would attempt to recreate the journey that made his grandfather famous. This was that day. 89 years ago, from the same spot in France, Louis Bleriot set off in a monoplane to cross the English Channel. 30 minutes later, he successfully landed on the cliffs of Dover, securing himself a place in aviation history. Using one of 3 surviving aircraft flown by his grandfather, Bleriot Jr. had high hopes for the expedition. They were short-lived. Less than 2 minutes in the air. Fortunately, only his pride was injured.
Dès que j'ai commencé à virer, l'avion ne répondait pas normalement, et puis plus je corrigeais dans un sens, et plus il continuait à s'embarquer dans un sens opposé, et puis bon, vraiment, je n'ai pas d'explication.
The rescue of the flimsy monoplane made of wood and silk was a success, and Bleriot Jr. still plans to make another attempt next year, on the 90th anniversary of the original flight. This flight will go down in history as a trial run.
And that's the World News tonight. Indira and I do for the World News at 9. We'll leave you now with pictures from the latest fashion hotspot. Last week it was the Paris catwalks. This week it's Beijing, where the autumn-winter fashion collections have just gone on show. Good night.